His war with Ukraine may not yet be over, but Russian President Vladimir Putin has already been dealt his biggest defeat. It didn't arrive on the front lines of the Donbass, nor is it confined to the battlefields of Kherson. Instead, it's taking place in close to a dozen independent nations across Eastern Europe and Central and Western Asia, including Moldova, Kazakhstan, and Armenia. These nations are just a few examples of what Russia likes to call its near abroad. And to understand that term, we have to first rewind to 1991 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It was one of the most seismic events in modern history, but the collapse of the Union wasn't quite as clean-cut as many people imagine. Yes, former Soviet republics gained a certain level of political independence, but since many of these nations were quite small and didn't necessarily have vast swathes of resources, strong domestic infrastructure, or vast networks of international relations, most of them continued to rely heavily on Russia in the years that followed. There were some exceptions to this trend. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, for example, swiftly developed stronger ties with Europe thanks to their geographic proximity to places like Scandinavia and Poland. This made it easier for them to integrate into Western institutions, establish trade routes across the European Union, and even join the EU in 2004. They were also able to sever their ties with Soviet-era power grids, halt Russian gas imports, and merge their power networks with continental Europe, as well as enter the NATO alliance. For most of the other 11 near-abroad nations, however, Russia remained the primary provider of trade, energy, and security. Places like Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, for example, have for decades depended on Russia to essentially prop up their economies. Many of these countries also have no other choice but to use Russia-controlled post-Soviet transport and logistic networks in order to export or import anything. And in order to support their families, plenty of young able-bodied Uzbeks, Tajiks, and other people from near-abroad countries have chosen to cross the border and seek employment in Russia, often working long hours in low-paid jobs, sending large parts of their salary home to help their loved ones. So, even though they were technically independent, many of these countries still effectively operated as though they were still in the Soviet Union. And that's exactly how Russia liked it. The Kremlin adored the idea of having close to a dozen countries that effectively relied on Moscow to survive, and even before Putin came to power, Russia exploited and extended its influence across these nations via various means. It locked countries into long-term trade deals and strict military alliances, interfered in their politics, supported separatist regions, and effectively enjoyed free rein to do whatever it wanted, whenever it wanted, safe in the knowledge that many of these countries had no other choice but to bend the knee. Once Putin became president, he continued this trend. In fact, he took it further, doing everything in his power to install puppet leaders in various countries like Belarus, enhancing their dependency on Russia and making it harder for them to ever leave its sphere of influence. He wanted the near abroad to stay that way for decades to come, so that even if the Soviet Union no longer existed on the map, its echoes were still felt in areas like politics and trade. And if any nation showed any signs of straying, Putin would punish them. We saw this in Georgia in 2008, for example. In April of that year, NATO announced that Georgia would eventually join the alliance. Moscow took that announcement as a threat to its regional hegemony. It sensed that Georgia, under the leadership of the pro-Western president at the time, Mikhail Saakashvili, was drifting slowly but surely out of its orbit. So, it orchestrated an invasion, accusing the country of committing genocide and seizing control of separatist regions. We saw it again in 2014, this time in Ukraine. Russia could sense that Kyiv was moving closer to Europe. Wide-scale protests had broken out across the country, with the Ukrainian public pressuring the government to strengthen its economic and political ties with the Western world. Putin couldn't afford for that to happen. He hated the idea of the EU, or especially NATO, moving closer to Russia's doorstep, and he was extremely fearful of losing his ability to project power across the Black Sea. So, once more, he orchestrated an invasion, sending in a small undercover army to seize control of the Crimean Peninsula. Unfortunately, the Western powers largely allowed all of this to happen, with US and European leaders essentially embracing the idea of the near abroad and accepting Russia's regional hegemony. As writer, analyst, and investigative journalist Casey Michelle notes in the Wall Street Journal, this includes such figures as Bill Clinton, who pressured Kazakhstan and Ukraine to give up their nuclear weapons to Russia, and Barack Obama, who turned a blind eye to Russia's invasion of Georgia and soft-walked a response to Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Time and again, Russia was effectively allowed to rule over, interfere with, and even invade the former Soviet republics, and because it was such an important player on the global stage, with such immense influence over the world's economy and the geopolitical landscape, other countries never dared to challenge it. This, in part, is surely what fueled Putin's decision to invade Ukraine in 2022. It wasn't just that he was concerned about Ukraine getting closer to the West. It was because he believed that he could pick and take whatever he wanted from the near-abroad nations. He could send in his army and seize control of other countries' territories at will, not only expanding his own sphere of power, but also cementing his legacy as one of the greatest Russian rulers, the modern-day Peter the Great he always dreamed of becoming. Nobody had stopped him before, so why would this time be any different? It would be just like in Georgia and Crimea. The mighty Russian army would roll over the borders, take what it wanted, and Putin's special military operation would be yet another success. That's what he thought, but he was wrong on every level. Nothing about the operation has gone to plan. Russia has failed to achieve its objectives, it suffered catastrophic losses, its forces continued to toil and stall in key sectors, and worst of all, the rest of the world, including the near abroad, has seen firsthand just how weak Moscow actually is. In many ways, Ukraine has set an example to all of those other old Soviet republics. It's shown them that they don't need to bend the knee and bow down to Russian pressure, that they can stand up to this country that has sought to bully them into submission for so many years, and that they can start to chart their own paths in the world as true independent countries. All they have to do is take the first step. And while some still have been a little reluctant to take that step, several of the former Soviet nations have at last started to turn their backs on Russia, shrinking the country's sphere of influence in the process and leaving Putin with far less power than he had just a few years ago. As Michelle notes, years into Mr. Putin's failed war in Ukraine, however, Russia's dreams of becoming a great power are a fantasy. Russia is no longer even a primary regional power in areas it once lorded over. Armenia is one of the best examples of this, because it's long been one of the most dependent nations on Moscow. It was a member of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, for example, an intergovernmental military alliance which also includes Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. It housed Russian border guards and even allowed Russia to operate a military base in Armenia's second-largest city. It also invested heavily in Russian energy and other resources and was, in effect, a vassal state for Moscow. Recent years, however, have seen the relationship between the two countries turn upside down. Realizing that Russia is no longer the reliable ally and security guarantor it once claimed to be, Yerevan has started to make some big moves. It froze its participation in the CSTO in 2024, for example, and has taken steps towards withdrawing from the alliance. It also forged new security relationships with countries like France, India, and the United States, removed Russian border guards from several locations, and even started discussions about the possibility of EU accession. The EU has welcomed Armenia warmly with a generous €52 million support package, and Putin is running scared. In May 2026, he openly threatened Armenia with a Ukrainian scenario if it continued to deepen its ties with Europe. In the past, those words alone would have been enough to spread fear and panic among the Armenian government and public. Now, however, Putin's proclamations have lost their power, and Armenia isn't the only one daring to defy the Russian leader. But before we look at some of the other nations turning their backs on Russia, this is why we make the military show, to explain how power really moves. If you're new here, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Moldova is another former Soviet state that isn't merely easing itself out of the Kremlin's control, but positively sprinting away from Moscow as quickly as it can. Again, this is a country that has historically depended on Russia to survive. For decades, almost all of Moldova's energy needs were met by Moscow. Russia was also the country's main export partner and has even maintained a military presence in the breakaway region of Transnistria, a slender sliver of land along Moldova's eastern edge. Russia has relied on Transnistria to enjoy continuous influence over Moldova's politics and economy. But things are starting to change. Despite Russian attempts to meddle in the election, the Moldovan people voted in the pro-European president, Maia Sandu, in 2020, with her Party of Action and Solidarity, PAS, securing a majority the following year. In the years that have followed, especially since the invasion of Ukraine, Moldova has made massive strides away from Russia. It has strengthened ties with the EU and NATO, reduced its dependence on Russian resources, and like Armenia, pursued the idea of EU accession. Even in the Russian-speaking region of Transnistria, people are growing increasingly tired and frustrated, with many eager to reintegrate with the rest of the country. And the Moldovan government has been looking at plans to bring the region back into the fold after decades of separation. Further east, Kazakhstan too has adopted an increasingly stern stance towards Moscow's actions in Ukraine. It has, for example, refused to accept Russia's annexation of Ukrainian territories and has slowly begun seeking to establish and strengthen connections with other countries. We've seen Kazakhstan expand its trade with China, the European Union, and the Gulf states, for instance, as well as explore new defense deals with Turkey and Western partners. To further reduce its reliance on Russia, it's focused on developing and exploiting the Trans-Caspian International Transport Route, otherwise known as the Middle Corridor, an increasingly important trade route that connects China and Europe, passing through Central Asia but never entering Russian territory. In May 2026, Kazakhstan also announced that its official history should no longer be linked to Russia or the Soviet Union, but should instead focus on its status as the modern-day successor to the medieval Golden Horde steppe empire. This may not seem all that important, but it's a powerful political message from Astana, a clear expression of the country's desire to be seen as an independent nation, separated completely from its colonial-style Soviet past. Kazakhstan's southeastern neighbor, Kyrgyzstan, has followed its example. When Russian historians argue that Kyrgyzstan shouldn't be classified as a former colony of Russia, for example, and demanded that their Kyrgyz counterparts rewrite their textbooks to adjust their terminology, Bishkek stood its ground. Historians and officials refused to comply with the Kremlin's request, and younger Kyrgyz people in particular see Russia in an increasingly unfavorable light, as noted by scholar Erika Marat, who recently wrote, "The perception of Russia and Kyrgyzstan has changed significantly since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Younger generations of scholars especially view Sovietization as an inherently colonial experience, on par with Europe's colonization of Africa and Asia." While Kyrgyzstan for now has little choice but to continue relying on Russia quite heavily for remittances, energy, and security, it too is starting to look for opportunities elsewhere. November 2025, for example, witnessed the first-ever strategic meeting between Chinese and Kyrgyz foreign ministers, which may signal the start of an increasingly important relationship moving forward. It's a similar story elsewhere across Central Asia. The geographic conditions of the countries in this part of the world make it difficult for them to extract themselves from Russia's orbit entirely, but several are doing whatever they can to become less dependent on Moscow and open up new options. Uzbekistan, for example, has been expanding trade with China and seeking closer ties with Turkey, the EU, and the Gulf states. Turkmenistan, meanwhile, has maintained a neutral stance over the war and started to export more resources towards China. And even in Tajikistan, where Russian control remains high, there are signs of Chinese economic influence becoming more important. The trend is only going to continue as the war goes on, as noted by American academic Walter Russell Mead in the Wall Street Journal. The longer the war goes on, the more Russian power in other former Soviet republics diminishes. The situation in the Caucasus and Central Asia is moving against Russia. The US, China, and Turkey are all developing economic and even military links that threaten Russia's hopes for control in territories first conquered by the Tsars. As Mead notes, this trend is playing out all across the near-abroad nations. In the Caucasus, for example, opinion polls show that the vast majority, 71% of Georgians, want to see their country join the European Union, while Azerbaijani-Russian relations have hit all-time lows. Even in Belarus, we can see the signs that Russian influence is beginning to wane. That very statement would have seemed outrageous only a year or two ago, since Belarus has always been seen as the ultimate puppet state of the Putin regime. But this is a testament to how bad the situation has become for Moscow. In June 2026, for example, the Belarusian president and Putin ally, Alexander Lukashenko, effectively gave in to an ultimatum issued by his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelensky. Zelensky had threatened Belarus with military action unless it disables signal relay stations that Russia was using to help guide Shahed attack drones towards targets in Ukraine. Even though Lukashenko has long been seen as Putin's personal lapdog, he still doesn't want to drag his country into the war any more than necessary. So he did as Zelensky demanded and physically made the war harder for Russia in the process. Lukashenko has also been spotted making several trips to China in recent times, and the potential implications of these visits have not gone unnoticed. Commenting on the Belarusian president's presence in Beijing, Ukraine Center for Countering Disinformation (CCD) wrote, Lukashenko's latest visit to China, which he uses as a counterweight to Russia, is another indication of the growing trend of Russia's declining foreign policy influence. After Eastern Europe, the South Caucasus and Central Asia, Russia is now losing influence even over its main satellite. The idea of all these near-abroad nations distancing themselves from Russia simply would have been possible prior to 2022. Before it invaded Ukraine, Russia certainly wasn't a perfect ally, partner or protector, but countries like Uzbekistan and Armenia at least felt that they could count on Moscow to aid with their economies and help them out as and when difficult situations arose. Now, those same nations see Russia in a completely different light, and in many ways, it's all Putin's fault. He invaded Ukraine believing it would show the world how strong Russia is. In reality, it did the opposite. The Kremlin's embarrassing failure to capture the Donbass and inability to achieve any of its stated objectives in Ukraine have actually revealed how weak it is. And the situation for Putin is becoming more humiliating by the day. All along the front lines, Russian forces are stalling. Ukraine is hitting back even harder than before, gaining ground in key areas and carrying out devastating long-range drone and missile strikes deep into the heart of Russia's regions, even striking the country's capital city. Kyiv's forces are also making major steps towards liberating Crimea, something that seemed impossible only a few years ago, and, as Michelle notes, Mr. Putin's belief that he can conquer even the rest of the Donbass looks increasingly at odds with reality, highlighting how empty Russia's claims to regional hegemony now are. The whole world can see this, including the former Soviet republics, and they don't like what they see, because Russia has revealed its true colors. It's not an ally or guardian. It's not a mighty military superpower that the whole world should fear. It's a desperate bully that tried to push one of its victims too far, and now the whole class has turned against it. When we add the facts that Russia's population is declining, its economy is in ruins, and many of its domestic industries are collapsing due to the unhealthy monopoly of the defense sector, the evidence paints a clear and conclusive picture. The days of the Russian Federation as we know it, and especially the Putin regime, are well and truly numbered. Now, you can learn more about how the tide of battle has turned against Putin in this video, which explains how Ukrainian special forces orchestrated a decisive ambush against their opponents in a key location in Zaporizhia. Alternatively, find out just how bad life has gotten for Russian soldiers in this video, which explores how the average life expectancy for frontline assault troops is measured in mere minutes, not days. And finally, subscribe to The Military Show for more breaking news, insights, and analysis of the war in Ukraine.